In this video, I want to revisit the argument from motion. Here's a basic outline of the argument I will be using. 1. Any being which changes must have its actuality outside of its essence. All beings cannot have actuality outside of their essence. Thus, there must be a being with actuality in its essence, and that which has actuality in its essence must be pure act. Pure act is what we mean by God, therefore God exists. Now, one key concept you have to grasp is the way that St. Thomas Aquinas analyzes change. St. Thomas follows Aristotle in understanding change as the actualization of a being in potency inasmuch as it is in potency. One motivation for this view comes from Parmenides' argument against change. Here's the basic idea. Outside of being, there is nothing. For there to be two beings, they must have one principle by which they are both beings, and a different principle by which they are different from each other. If outside of being there is nothing, there is no principle by which beings can be diversified. Thus, being can only be one. This position is also known as monism. What does this have to do with change? Well, for there to be change, the end product of change must be different from the initial state. But if a being is one, then there cannot be this difference, and so there cannot be change. Another way to put this is that there is nothing outside of being, so there's nothing which a being can change into. Being can only be one. For a being to change, there must be more than one being, therefore a being cannot change. Yet it is clear that there is change, and that there are multiple beings. So how do we solve this problem? Well, one solution is to agree that outside of being is nothing, but instead of thinking of adding something to being, think of taking something away from being. In other words, there's a principle that limits being had by creatures so that one being has this mode of being and another being has this mode of being. There are multiple beings. For there to be two beings, they must have one principle by which they are both beings and a different principle by which they are different from each other. Outside of being, there is nothing. Therefore, there cannot be any positively existing principle by which two beings are differentiated. Thus, there must be a merely limiting principle by which beings are differentiated. St. Thomas says that this limiting principle is what makes a being what it is. The reason for this is because if you have two beings, a cat and a dog, they are both the same in that they have being. What makes a dog what it is cannot be existence because a cat also has existence. If a dog were precisely a dog because it has existence, then a cat, since it also has existence, would also have to be a dog. But this is absurd. So the cause for what makes a creature what it is must be this other principle, the principle of limitation. The name St. Thomas gives for this limiting principle for what a creature is essence. Now, of course, a monist is going to object that a limitation is outside of being and thus is nothing. So we shouldn't think of this principle of limitation as something outside of real being. In fact, a whole being, at least when we're talking about creatures, is a composition of act and potency. As Norris Clark said, essence and existence's distinct reality must be less than that of a complete being or thing, but rather that of two mutually correlative co-principles or co-constituents, each incomplete by itself, within the enveloping unity of the one complete being, distinct but inseparable, i.e., one cannot exist alone without the other. So this should not be thought of as if we are suggesting this limitation is an independent being. It is a distinct principle of finite beings, but not a thing of itself. Now, since essence is merely a limitation of being, it doesn't exist without being, and in fact, being is what makes essence real or actual. Consider in itself, therefore, essence is merely something that could exist or which is potential. So one could argue that essence is potential with respect to the actuality of being/existence. Whatever is wholly actualized by another is wholly potential in itself. Essence is wholly actualized by existence, therefore essence is wholly potential in itself. It turns out that not every being within the same essence has the same amount of being. A dog, for example, according to essence, has 4 legs, but there are some dogs that only have 3 legs. So even though a 3-legged dog and a 4-legged dog have the same essence or potential for receiving being, both actually have a different degree of being. And if the 3-legged dog were to grow a 4th leg, its potential for that being would be actualized. In this way, St. Thomas Aquinas thinks of change as the actualization of potential. It is gaining some degree of being which is within the scope of the essence of a creature's capacity to receive it. It is evident from this that whatever changes is going to have these 2 principles of potentiality and actuality, essence and existence. And what the changing being is, a dog say, is defined as opposed to the other changing being. It is evident from this that whatever changes is going to have these 2 principles of potentiality and actuality, essence and existence, and what the changeable being is, a dog say, is defined as opposed to other changeable beings, for example a cat, by its different limitation, its essence of being. Thus, what a merely changeable being is merely potential considered in itself. From this we can get the principle of causality and the first premise of the argument from motion. A being which has actuality either has actuality in its essence or in something outside of its essence. Any being which changes is wholly potential in its essence. Therefore, any being which changes must have actuality outside of its essence. A lot of people seem to think of this as a sort of deistic putting things in motion where the creature gains actuality and it no longer needs actuality outside of its essence to sustain it. That isn't what St. Thomas Aquinas believed, however. St. Thomas thought that the actualization of the being referred back to something that has the actuality essentially, and I think the above argument shows why. To illustrate the point, imagine we have a ball. We know that the ball can change colors and still remain a ball. Thus, its essence, a ball, must be potential with respect to the different colors. It may be the case that the ball is red, but this color doesn't come from what makes it a ball. The red color must come from some other being, such as the paint. Now, it is still true to say that, in a sense, that the redness belongs to the ball, but more essentially, it belongs to the red paint, or whatever you want to say is red by nature. The ball has redness of the paint in a derived way from that which has redness essentially, because in itself the ball is merely potential for the redness. The same logic we can apply to all changeable beings. If a changeable being is potential with respect to some form of actuality, it can only receive that actuality from something that has it essentially, because in itself it's indifferent or potential with respect to that actuality if it can change. And we can present other examples, such as an object which is not wet by its essence being wet by sharing in the wetness of water. It would be silly to suggest that the object no longer needs the water to continue to remain wet once its wetness is actualized. The object isn't wet by its own essence, so it depends on something which has wetness in its essence for it to remain wet. This goes for all actualization of potential, because an essence can only be actualized by another if it is in itself potential with respect to the actuality. Now, wait a minute, you might say, couldn't one receive the actuality from a being that has it non-essentially? The answer is yes, but then I would just run the argument for this being which also doesn't have the actuality in its essence, and conclude that it must get its actuality in something outside of its essence. And you regress further. Could we just regress this infinitely? The answer is no, because you would have the problem of the actuality existing nowhere. This gets into the premise 2 of the argument from motion. All beings cannot have actuality outside of their essence. To illustrate the point, imagine that the actuality we're talking about here is $1,000. You don't have $1,000 as part of your essence. You may have it in a debit card, for example, in which case you have it derivatively. But even a debit card doesn't have $1,000 in its essence. A debit card derives its money from a bank. Now let's say that the bank has this money in another bank, and that bank has it in another bank, and so on to infinity. Clearly that wouldn't work because there would be no $1,000 actually in existence to be derived. If all banks had the money derivatively, there would be no banks with $1,000 in it, and the banks couldn't actually have it derivatively from each other because none of them would have the $1,000 in it. In other words, $1,000 or any form of actuality can only be had derivatively if it's ultimately derived from something that has $1,000 in its essence. So we have at least one being which has actuality in its essence. What else can we determine about it? Well, we can determine that its essence must be pure act. In other words, it cannot have any potential in its essence. Why not? Well, remember, we derive this idea of potentiality from the essence-existence distinction. Potentiality is just the essence that is limiting the existence of beings so that you can get different beings. If a being has any potential whatsoever, that potential will define it. It will be its essence. That potential will make a dog actual precisely in the way a dog is actual as opposed to a cat, and a cat actual precisely in the way a cat is as opposed to a dog. A being which has actuality either has actuality in its essence or in something outside of its essence. If a being is in any way potential, that potential will be the essence of the being. Therefore, any being which is in any way potential must have actuality outside of its essence. One might object here that there are other possible combinations of actuality and potentiality, but let's take a look at 5 different possibilities. Potentiality and actuality in the essence. Actuality in the essence and potentiality outside of the essence. Potentiality in the essence and actuality outside of the essence. Potentiality without actuality, or actuality without potentiality. For the first, as we described earlier, what defines one creature as opposed to another isn't existence. It is the limitation on existence. To repeat what I said earlier, if you have 2 beings, a cat and a dog, they are both the same in that they have being. What makes a dog what it is cannot be existence because a cat also has existence. So if a dog were a dog precisely because it has existence, then a cat, since it also has existence, would also have to be a dog. But this is absurd. So the cause for what makes a creature what it is must be the other principle, the principle of limitation, and it is precisely because this principle isn't a positively existing reality in itself that means its actuality must be had in something outside of its essence. One could imagine, for example, something which is essentially hot, which has heat as part of what it is. Now contrast this against something which is essentially red. What makes the hot thing hot and the red thing red? It cannot be the existence of the hot thing or the red thing because they are both the same insofar as they exist. Rather, it has to be the limitation on existence such that the hot thing has the existence in this limited way, and the red thing has existence in another limited way. And this heat and red are merely potential in themselves, so it has to be actualized by another. You can't have a limited form of being which has any degree of pure actuality in an underived way, because the metaphysics of limitation itself includes these principles of act and potency. So anything that's composed of act and potency, anything that's limited, anything that's multiple, is going to ultimately be actualized by something else. Also, if you think of the essence of the creature as being partially actual and partially potential, then what you have is a being which is defined by both actuality and potentiality. It would be a composite, and composite beings depend on their parts for their existence. This means that in itself, the whole composite wouldn't necessarily exist, and if the whole composite being doesn't necessarily exist, then it is potential wholly with respect to existence. It turns out that if a being is potential with respect to existence, considered in itself, then it cannot be in any way actual considered in itself, because a being cannot even have a little bit of actuality unless it exists. So we can eliminate number 1 as an option. What about 2? Well, again, potentiality is going to limit actuality and define what it is. If we suppose that it doesn't, then we will have unlimited actuality plus some limited form of actuality. This cannot be, because outside of unlimited actuality is nothing. Unlimited actuality would already contain all of the actuality in some limited form of actuality. In other words, you would have to have a principle able to receive some finite portion of actuality, potentiality, and some principle that already has all of the actuality in it. You can't add some form of actualities to something if it already has it. So 2 is impossible. 3 is possible, but it requires a being to be dependent on something outside of it, as we said. 4 isn't possible because potentiality wouldn't exist without actuality, so that leaves us with 5 as the underived actuality and the first cause of all limited beings, which is pure actuality. Now notice, since there are only 2 principles, being and limitation of being, this purely actual being has to be one or the other, but the purely actual being cannot be the limitation of being, because the limitation of being is wholly potential considered itself. It must therefore be the principle of actuality, or being itself. Furthermore, since that which is pure act cannot be composite, it can only have one feature. Anything that exists must at least have existence, therefore pure act can be nothing more than just existence itself. So if you pay attention, you will see that the argument gets you to the same conclusion I got in my Proving Christianity series. You can use the same arguments there to prove that God is one, intelligent, and omnibenevolent, starting with the argument for motion. So something else I think you should note is that whenever we consider the argument for motion, understanding the basic principles such as essence and existence, act and potency completely, all of the objections that you commonly see to the argument for motion could completely dissipate. Like, for example, the idea that, the St. Thomas Aquinas' first way doesn't prove that the first being is purely actual. It could be potential and actual. But whenever you understand that existence is actuality to the potentiality of essence, you can realize that what the creature is going to be completely potential. It cannot be actual. And so this objection is easily refuted if you just understand the basic principles. So I think a lot more could be said if you take all of this into account and use it in response to some of these objections. But for now, I think this is going to be all that I'm going to say. Thanks for watching.